everyone. Today, what I'm going to be covering, um, on the back of the classes I spent talking about various jobs that you could get should you prefer pursue grad school, I wanted to talk about an interesting and somewhat emerging phenomenon of just how social media is involved in certain careers and even in academic oriented careers. I've come to find that social media has become a very interesting avenue for people who have spent any time in academia, whether they continue on to be a tenured professor or they leave for other employment, doctors, all sorts of people with research oriented backgrounds and careers are using social media in a really interesting way to promote scholarship. So, what I wanted to cover today was to talk a little bit generally about social media, what is it good for, etc., and then tell you a little bit about this emerging phenomenon of academics and researchers and professionals using social media to get information and messages out there. So, in terms of social media, I'm sure you're all familiar with social media and you're adept at using it. The amount of social media platforms out there has exploded over the last 15 years or so. I personally remember a time before social media when it was a little bit more of a Wild West situation. When Facebook first emerged, it was just for students, and so there weren't a lot of parents or anything on Facebook. And so the way that people interacted with Facebook was quite a bit different and quite a bit more reckless than it is today. These days, pretty much everyone's on Facebook. Your parents are probably on Facebook. Your grandparents are probably on Facebook. Your boss. So, as far as I'm aware, for a lot of younger people in your age bracket, Facebook is kind of lame at this point. That's what I've always heard from students, that a lot of you don't even use Facebook. Now, Facebook is still a massive platform that people use to connect with one another, but I have been made aware, and I am familiar with some research indicating that platforms like Instagram are a lot more popular with college aged individuals. Whether it's just because a different demographic has started using it, whether it's that it's a more visually based platform. It's really all about the pictures, it's all about the artistry. Different social media platforms serve different purposes and tend to have different people engaging with that platform. Others, I know a lot of college age students also use Snapchat. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with Snapchat. The basic function is that you can send temporary images or videos to people that then disappear. This initially seemed like a great way to get past the fact that posting things on social media that are problematic or offensive can get you in trouble. The idea that the images sent on Snapchat are temporary. You guys likely know, but always a point of caution that when you put something on the internet on any social media platform, it does continue to exist in some form or another. You can take screenshots with Snapchat, but things on the internet are forever. So even if it's something like Twitter, where you know you don't have any parents or colleagues on that kind of a platform, always being conscientious about what you're putting out into the world, given that we live in such a highly interconnected age where anything you do put on the internet does continue to last forever. Now, YouTube, interestingly, this might not be something that you so immediately think of as a platform you use to engage with people, but YouTube is a social media platform that allows people to post video based content. Interestingly, I've got some data that I'll show you in a second that indicates that YouTube is actually the most commonly used social media platform. So, despite the fact that the majority of us aren't YouTubers, it is a highly influential platform. And then lastly, something like LinkedIn that most of you have, a professional based social media platform that's really all geared towards making professional connections. Obviously, the sort of content that you post to your LinkedIn, the sort of persona you develop on LinkedIn is likely to be vastly different than the one that you might have developed on Instagram or Snapchat. But again, a word of caution that the stuff that you put on social media does all sort of collectively create your online persona. And at this point, your online persona is a massive part of the identity that you're creating and putting out into the world. So just making sure that you're putting out things that you wouldn't be embarrassed about later. Again, like I mentioned, I remember Facebook coming up when it was basically just you and your close friends on it. And so writing something super cringe was a lot more common. You guys likely are smarter at this than a lot of people, but just keeping in mind that what you put out into the internet should hopefully reflect something that you can be proud of. My advice is always I'd recommend against posting something if it wouldn't be something you'd want both your mom and your boss to see. So that's all I'll say about that. So, like I said, I have some data on social media. This just seems like an interesting topic. I know a lot of students, for example, in my statistics class, tend to be interested on how social media is used, how it affects people psychologically. So, I thought it just might be interesting for you guys to see some of the research that I've encountered on social media use and its effects. So, as you can see from this graphic here, social media use is highly prevalent, particularly Facebook and YouTube. Again, I've heard over and over from students that Facebook is sort of over. You guys don't interact with that platform much or at all, but it is important to keep in mind that since the vast majority of people are on Facebook, understanding its power as a platform. And again, like I mentioned, YouTube surprisingly is the most commonly used social media platform. Now, this I think is a really important point to keep in mind when considering how YouTube tends to be used. I'm not sure what you guys look at when you're on YouTube. I know it can be as harmless as watching makeup tutorials and cooking videos. That's the light side of YouTube, but obviously it can get people down really awful conspiracy theory rabbit holes. It's a platform, as with others, that is ripe for disinformation and for misinformation. And so, keeping in mind that even if you don't sort of think of YouTube as being such a powerful platform, it really, really is. And its role in shaping what people believe to be true, the ease with which people can seek information that confirms what they already believe to be true, whether or not they're correct. Keep in mind that the power of these platforms is substantial. As you can see, the rest of the platforms all are basically living at about the same level of usage. Your Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, those are all quite a bit lower than Facebook and YouTube. So all of those other platforms, they are newer than Facebook and YouTube, so it sort of makes sense. They might appeal to different demographics. But again, this all goes to say that social media is very widely used, and thus its purpose, whether for good or for ill, is obviously going to create a lot of room for societal impact. A vast majority of people, again, to reiterate this point that social media usage is prevalent, and obviously, whatever its effect on us is going to be pretty profound. Many people report that they use Facebook on a daily basis or several times a day. So, whatever the effect of social media on us, the sway that it has on us psychologically and in terms of the information we collect, it's going to be very powerful. Most people say that it wouldn't be hard to give up social media, but I would say reporting that you would do it is likely far off from actually doing it. Most of us likely would be able to take a break, not log on to our Twitter or Facebook temporarily. But I think even if we consider ourselves someone who would be able to give up social media, the fact is that we just live in an extremely plugged in world. I mean, think about the current moment that we're living through, how we're all stuck in our homes, right? The power of social media to continually enable us to be connected in this unprecedented time. I would say that given that this data is 2 years old at this point, I would likely assume that these figures may be a little bit different, that given that we're living through this extremely not normal time. Again, in terms of usage and age demographics, again, you do see that rate of usage for different platforms is going to be moderated by age. Again, I've seen figures and I've heard from students that Snapchat really does seem to be the platform of choice for people who would be your typical college age students, as well as Instagram. Interestingly, not as many Twitter users among college age students. And again, I can speculate on why this is. I would assume that the visual nature of Instagram versus Snapchat is very appealing. Twitter is all informational based, right? Despite the fact that you can post a picture on Twitter, it's really all about the transmission of information. So I'm going to focus a lot on Twitter later because given that its purpose is mainly the transmission of ideas and information, it does have a particularly interesting role in our ability as academics, professionals, researchers to transmit information to clear up misconceptions. So again, I'm going to talk a lot more about Twitter later. Now, one thing that I'm constantly hearing from people, one hot topic that gets debated quite a bit in professional conversations and in media based conversations and in personal conversations, is whether or not smartphone usage and social media has overall been having a detrimental impact on our psychological health and well being. This is an interesting conversation to have. I definitely think that, again, the powerful sway of social media makes it such that any possible problems or issues are going to present themselves pretty powerfully. So, for example, the issue of bullying is something that is obviously tremendously impactful for kids and adolescents' psychological health and well being. The possibility of bullying to move online and to follow kids home when, in the age before social media, kids would at least have a respite from bullying when they'd be home with their families, hopefully. There is obviously the possibility that the power of social media to connect us would have a detrimental impact, for example, if a child is being bullied. I would highlight some research that came out last year, though, indicating that the detrimental impact of social media and smartphones might be slightly overstated. And in a massive study on 350,000 adolescents, the research indicated that the use of technology didn't have as much of an impact on teens' psychological well being as may have initially been thought or predicted. It did appear that there was a very small effect. And when I say a very small effect, this research looked at a whole host of life factors and experiences and looked at the correlation between those experiences and mental health. A really interesting effect to emerge was that just the fact of wearing glasses actually had a bigger relationship and a more negative impact on adolescent mental health than the effect of technology use. So, wearing glasses appeared to have a larger relationship with mental health outcomes than the use of technology. Now, you can speculate why this would be the case, right? Are kids who wear glasses more bullied? Are there accessibility issues? You can speculate on what causes that effect, but the broader point is that obviously there's going to be a whole host of factors that are going to impact adolescent psychological well being. It appears that the impact of technology itself is not the greatest factor in determining someone's psychological health and well being. I will say that it's not to say that an individual experiencing online bullying is not going to be heavily affected by that. Obviously, there are individual cases that might be different, but in this very large study, it did indicate that overall, the effect across people is not as great as we may have initially thought. Now, of course, again, we're not just a mass of people, we're all individuals, and so the effect of social media, it is going to depend on your situation and who you are as a person. So all of the speculated effects of social media, for example, the negative effects of social media that people speculate may exist, something like social comparison, the fact that when you see someone very aspirational, beautiful, or wealthy on a platform like Instagram, you may automatically begin to make those comparisons between yourself and other people. And those sorts of social comparisons where you feel like you don't measure up can certainly have a detrimental effect on how you feel about yourself. Cyberbullying, obviously, if peer to peer aggression is following you into online platforms, that's something that can hurt individuals and obviously is negative. Others that I haven't mentioned yet. One thing that I sometimes pay attention to, the branding that takes place on social media. Um, Obviously, you on Instagram, Snapchat, Words with Friends, whatever it is, I'm sure you guys have noticed that you are being marketed to constantly on social media, always with the ads. And really creepy effects. Like, have you guys ever noticed that you'll like say something out loud or even just think something and all of a sudden there's an ad on your Facebook trying to sell you that product, it is eerie. And certainly some of this might be a sort of illusory correlation where weird things do happen. I certainly do think it is the case that social media companies and platforms do track our information quite heavily. The fact that social media is free to use, you have to keep in mind that if a platform is free to use, you ultimately are the product, right? So the way that a company like Facebook is able to have a productive business model is that they're collecting data on you, and you are the product, and your information is being sold to companies. So the fact that sometimes you'll go into a Google search, type something, and all of a sudden you're being inundated with ads on your Facebook or your Instagram for that same product, that is a real thing. So I personally think that this is not necessarily a good thing. The fact that our data is being used and sold in ways that we might not consent to, I would say that that, in my mind, whether we're aware of it or not, is a broadly negative consequence of social media. Some people speculate that social media use can be addictive and can lead to compulsive use. Certainly, if an individual feels that social media use is causing psychological harm, but simultaneously feels they can't stop, yes, obviously that is an issue. In terms of social media being addictive in the same way that drugs or alcohol or even gambling may be, I don't think the research supports that compulsive or addictive use of social media is such a widespread problem. Again, I think people might overstate their ability to log off social media long term. But I think that likely it's not the case that that's the same thing as really using it compulsively or addictively. Um, Again, there's some research out there on compulsive use of social media. It really just doesn't rise to the level of any other of the highly addictive substances or addictive factors like gambling. It's really just not on the same scale whatsoever. Now, despite the fact that there's all of this room for a negative effect of social media, obviously there has to be positives that make it something that is viable, that makes it so widespread. And so I think it is worthwhile to think about what the pros are to weigh against all of the aforementioned cons. So there are plenty of good reasons that social media should exist. So a lot of the main ones are social. So despite the fact that social media enables social interactions, both positive and negative, right? So bullying is something that could happen. The vast majority of interactions that we're going to have on social media are going to be with people that we like, with our friends and with our family. So, one great thing that social media has enabled is just the ability to stay in touch with people, right? We just have more ways that we can communicate with our loved ones. We can send a Facebook message, an Instagram direct message, right? There's just more opportunities to stay in touch with people. And our social relationships, I'm sure you can all tell in this present very, very difficult moment, that staying in touch with your loved ones is an absolute source of critical well being. So obviously, that's a good thing, right? Since we're all stuck in our houses, the fact that we have so many ways to stay in touch with people, I think, is critical in our ability to make it through this with our sanity intact. You can make new connections on social media, right? Again, there's just more opportunities to make new connections. You can make professional connections on LinkedIn. You can make friends who share your interests on, who knows, a subreddit or whatever it may be. You can make new friends and connections on social media. And just the fact that we have new ways to establish new connections, again, having social connections is good for us. It's good for our psychological health and well being. And having all of these diverse opportunities to make remote friendships and relationships, I would say overall is a positive thing. You can create and manage your reputation. Again, LinkedIn is going to be a great way to professionally develop a persona that enables you to advance your career by making connections. Additionally, obviously, we're all familiar with the famous Instagram influencer or YouTuber, right? You can create a reputation, you can create a whole online persona that is your brand that enables you to make money. Um, Obviously, that's not going to be something that everyone does, but even those of us who don't have an Instagram where we have enough followers to make any marketing money, you can still forge a reputation on social media. Again, I'm going to talk a lot about Twitter later and how some academics and professionals are forging really wide reaching platforms on Twitter to reach people and to dispel misinformation and to highlight important research. So I would say that your ability to forge a professional or even personal reputation on social media, this can be used for good or for ill, but if it's used for good, then I think that that is a good thing. And on that same note, to be able to communicate with a wider audience about the things that matter, if you're a researcher who really believes in the value and importance of your research in advancing human health and well being, the idea that you have the ability to transmit information about your work to a wider audience, as opposed to just having your research collect dust in a peer reviewed journal that no one outside of your immediate field is going to read. Again, if it's information that you care about and think is important, the ability of social media to cast a wider net and to have your information exposed to a wider audience. Again, this could be used for good or evil purposes, but it is possible that the effect of social media to transmit information to a wider audience can be a good thing. Now I want to move into talking more about this idea of scholarship on social media. So to start, I wanted to highlight the fact that there is really research on social media itself. So the research and the scholarship on the way social media affects us. So I know it feels maybe like social media is a new enough phenomenon that there couldn't be a whole host of scholarship and research available on it. That's actually not true. It's been around long enough that enough people have been able to forge professional research projects on the way that social media is affecting us. So if you were to just do a basic Google Scholar search on the effect of social media, you have, at the time I created this lecture about a year ago, 4 million plus. I'm sure there's more than that now. And just a smattering of some of the titles you could read if you're looking at some of these Google Scholar results, right? The effect of social media communication on consumer perception of brands, right? Marketing and branding type scholars are obviously going to be interested on whether or not this whole new format of branding and marketing has an effect on consumer behavior. So there's research on marketing. News sharing and social media, the effect of gratification and prior experience. So social media is a massive way that we get information, right? We don't just get our information from reading the newspaper or watching the news on TV. A lot of us get our news on social media. Again, for better or for worse, it's going to be a major way that people seek to collect information about the world and what's going on. So researchers who are interested on misinformation and disinformation, right? Social media is something that has already been studied pretty extensively in terms of the role social media has in the sharing of news and information. There's the rise of all of these GoFundMe's and Kickstarters, right? There's the opportunity to do charitable giving through social networking sites and social media. So there's also interest in how donations and charity have been impacted by the rise of social media. So you can just see from these titles the diversity of titles. Now, if you were to focus your search on PsycInfo, and so just focusing on research on the psychology of social media, obviously you're paring down the results and you're just focusing on psychological literature, but you're still looking at the tens of thousands of hits on social media and its relationship to psychology. Just alone at the time that I collected this data, there were over 500 literature reviews on the psychology of social media. So recall that a literature review is a publication that synthesizes and summarizes a pre-existing body of research, right? There's that many literature reviews to choose from to start to get acquainted with research on the psychology of social media. So again, I'll just show you a selection of titles from the PsycInfo results of the psychology of social media. So, for example, there's interest on how different personality or individual difference characteristics influence or shape the way that people interact with social media. So, for example, narcissistic adolescents, attention seeking, follow social rejection, links with social media disclosure, problematic social media use, and smartphone stress. So, narcissism is a personality characteristic. It's also a personality disorder, but narcissism is basically a characteristic that all of us have to a greater or lower extent, right? Some people can be more narcissistic without having narcissistic personality disorder. So, this particular project was interested on how more narcissistic adolescents might be using social media a little bit differently. So, personality psychology has hitched onto trying to understand how personality relates to social media use. Researchers interested in romantic relationships. So, social media addiction in romantic relationships. Does users' age influence vulnerability to social media infidelity? So, one interesting phenomenon that social media might enable is more cheating behaviors. So, cheating on your romantic partner by talking to someone or sharing materials on social media. There's interest in how that's impacting social relationships. So, this particular research was interesting because it found that age differentially impacts cheating via social media. It indicated that younger individuals, there is a relationship between social media use and some cheating behaviors, but for older individuals, not so much. So, interesting research on how age and social media use interact to shape our social experiences and romantic relationships. And this is an interesting one, especially given that work and school has now all moved online. This particular research was interested on creativity and team performance, so mechanisms to enhance team creative performance through social media. This, I think, is particularly interesting in the given moment because this research basically found that it was possible to improve working together as a team in a professional setting, and that working online can work to make certain team members more creative in the way they seek to resolve problems. So I would say that given that so many meetings have moved on to Zoom or WebEx, I think that this research is particularly interesting in the current moment. Basically, that just because things have moved online doesn't mean that our ability to work together creatively is necessarily impeded, and it might actually be that it'll help us think a little bit more out of the box or creatively about the problems we're encountering. And this one is like the most extremely 2020 title I could find. A content analysis of Joule discussions on social media using Reddit to understand patterns and perceptions of Joule use. So, Reddit being a social media platform where people can post discussion boards on various topics. Apparently, the researchers were interested on how Reddit use was impacting the ways that people talk about Juuling, which, right, that's a kind of vape, right? That's a kind of vape. I don't know. You guys would have to tell me. If we were in person, I'm sure you guys would tell me. But again, the possibility for social media to be an avenue to transmit information about different substances that adolescents might use. It's just a whole new world of social media, and there's so many psychological questions to ask and answer on just how social media is impacting us psychologically. Okay, so now moving on more directly to this idea of academia and scholarship being transmitted on social media. Not scholarship on the topic of social media, but how academia and scholarship might use social media as a way to promote research and scholarship. So, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the phrase the ivory tower. So, academia is at times referred to as an ivory tower, meaning that people who are in academia or who do research sort of lock themselves away and sort of feel above everyone else. And it's sort of living in this rarefied air where you can only talk about your work with fellow experts and you're sort of not necessarily connected to everyone else. This is the idea of the ivory tower. Now, additionally, I would say that this ivory tower perception that academics are sort of above it all, I would say it's not actually true. It doesn't really ring true in my experience that this is actually something that academics think about themselves. Obviously, some people are up their own ass in academia, but most of them aren't. That's my perception, at least. But the problem is that the research that academics do, even if they have the best intentions of promoting it and making people aware of their research, as you guys can attest to, academic research can just be really boring. Reading academic articles is a slog. It's written in often overly technical or jargon laden language. Again, despite the fact that, in my perception, academics aren't necessarily doing it on purpose, they're not making their work boring to read on purpose. It's just the sort of environment that you enter. It's a certain writing style that we get used to, and it's talking to your fellow colleagues in academia all the time. And it can make your work seem sort of out of touch and boring to other people. So there's a disconnect here, right? Academics, I would argue, want their research to be broadly available to people. But there's this disconnect whereby the research itself is just boring and no one wants to read it. So, how do you bridge the gap when you want to highlight the importance of your research, but people find it dull or hard to understand? I would suggest that part of the way that academics are rising to the challenge of the modern age is by using social media for this exact purpose. Academics, more and more, are using social media to highlight, promote, and put their research out into the world in a way that's a lot more accessible, easy to understand, easy to access. And I think that this explosion of academics using social media, and I'll show you what this looks like in a little bit, I think that this is part of a broader attempt for academics and researchers and experts to try and make their work and their research more highly accessible, more interesting, and do their part to make the information that they are experts in available to the people who could benefit from it. Okay, so academics, they're all over Twitter, really. Now, I'm not talking about celebrities, politicians, journalists, and other influencers, right? There's obviously tons of randoms and celebrities and all manner of people on Twitter. I'm talking specifically about people who engage in scholarship on Twitter. So, as I mentioned earlier, right, Twitter is about the transmission of information. It's about sending tweets, right? It's about sending these prepackaged, short bits of information. Okay, so in terms of what is Twitter and how it works, right, I'm sure you're all basically familiar with the process of Twitter, right? You just write up a tweet, it has a character limit on it, and you just send that information out onto your Twitter page. And unless your Twitter page is restricted, anyone can go out and read it. So academics are using Twitter and they're putting information out in the world for a number of purposes. And I'll walk through all of these individually, but basically, you can promote yourself on Twitter. Academics are a certain class of professional. And so they're interested in promoting themselves and their work and forging professional reputations. So Twitter lets them do that. A lot of academics are interested in bringing up the people that are the next generation of academics. So most professors have research labs comprised of graduate students and undergrad research associates. So they've got this entire collaborative lab of people, and a lot of academics are using Twitter to promote the work of their talented research assistants and graduate research assistants. They can promote the work itself, right? They can really be more interested in promoting the work and the information that their research has discovered, right? So to promote yourself and to promote your scholarship, this can go hand in hand, and it's just sort of a matter of intent. But, these two things can go hand in hand. By promoting the work that you do, you can promote yourself. And a really important one, I would say, is to dispel misconceptions on an area of expertise. So this is just going to depend on what an academic is an expert in. There's likely to be some misconceptions out there about any number of academic or research oriented fields. And Twitter is just a great way to hop out into the world and try and disabuse people of some popular misconceptions. So, in terms of promoting yourself, you're going to see people do this on Twitter, academics and everyone else. A lot of us are just out there trying to make a name for ourselves. And you can see a lot of academics doing this as well. So, famous academic cognitive scientist Steven Pinker at Harvard. Obviously, he's a pretty famous writer. And a lot of the times he's just using his Twitter to try and get people to buy his books to a fair amount of success. Someone like Jonathan Haidt, famous psychologist out of NYU, right? His Twitter has a ton of followers, and so he's going to use that pretty large following to try and make sure that people know that he's got books published out there. It's not all just the most famous academics out there who are trying to promote their books. Dr. Eric Rauchway, a historian out of California, he's out there trying to promote a book that he came out with, right? And so even though his Twitter following is not as large as someone like Dr. Haidt, it's still going to be an avenue that somebody has to promoting their book. Obviously, somebody who's written a book has put a lot of time and energy and invested a lot into producing that piece of work. And so a lot of academics are going to use Twitter to try and make sure that people know that that information is available out there. You can disagree with self promotion as something that's right to do on Twitter or find it kind of icky, but at the end of the day, academics as well as other sorts of professionals, a little bit of self promotion is going to be inevitable if you want to succeed. So then moving on to the promotion of others that you work with. So Twitter is going to be a great way for more prominent or famous professors and academics to highlight the work of people who are coming up in academia behind them. So most professors have graduate students that they want to make sure have good prospects on the job market after they leave grad school. And so the lab Twitters can be used to highlight those collaborative accomplishments. So for example, a former mentor of mine, Dr. Jay Van Bavel out of NYU, he's got a very prolific research lab with lots of graduate students and research assistants. And Dr. Van Bavel is constantly using the lab Twitter page to highlight whenever any one of his students, current or former, have accomplished something or gotten a paper published. Someone like Dr. Joyner, a very famous researcher on suicidality, his research again is pretty prominent, and so his lab page is meant to highlight the collaborative successes of all of the various students and research assistants working in his lab. So now on to the promotion of the scholarship itself. A lot of academics are using individual Twitter pages to communicate with larger audiences about the information that their research can help clarify. So, for better or for worse, a lot of people use social media to gather information and to stay informed. Anyone who's using Twitter in the present moment knows that it's one of the fastest ways that you can get updates about what's going on in the world. And so, despite the fact that information on social media is not vetted and it doesn't go through a peer review process, it does mean that it gets transmitted to a wider audience and more people will be exposed to information put out into social media. So I think some factors about Twitter itself really does lend itself to scholarship being packaged in a more accessible version that does make it easier to communicate with broader and non-expert audiences. So in Twitter, you need to condense your information down. A single tweet has can only max out to 280 characters. Now you can thread together tweets, and often academics need to create Twitter threads to put together all the information on a given topic. But I think the best Twitter scholars are going to be people that are really good at using the character limit to create really concise bits of information, and they thread tweets together in a way that's very clear and that has good narrative and logical flow to it. So some people are better at this and some people are worse at this, but the fact that Twitter makes you have a certain character limit and forces you to thread things together in a certain sequence, I think that the people that are successful at this, it makes it so that their information reaches a much wider audience. Altogether, it's going to be a much less formal presentation of information than academic environments. It's not like giving a colloquium, and it's certainly not like writing a manuscript for a peer-reviewed journal. The language can be a lot more casual. It can get rid of a lot of the not as important jargony or technical terms. So it's going to be something that's going to be accessible and appeal more to non-expert audiences. Okay, so the fact that it's not peer-reviewed information, obviously that's going to be a bit of a pro and a con, right? You can't necessarily know whether or not the information you see on social media has been vetted, and it hasn't necessarily passed through the eyes of fellow peers or experts in the field. So that's obviously a downside. You have to keep in mind that the information you see on Twitter should be independently verified. But the upside is that information and research doesn't need to go through the extensive convoluted, and lengthy process of peer review approval. It's a way that researchers can get information out quickly. Now, again, I will caution you that you can't always believe everything that you see on social media, and so verifying things from multiple sources, verifying things independently, that's going to be very critical. But another thing you can do is you can also verify the source, right? Who's putting out the information? Are they an expert? Do they have qualifications? Do they have a PhD or an MD? So there are ways that you can go about making sure that the information that you get on social media, you at least vet it and review it a little bit on your own. So a lot of scholars are going to use the structure of Twitter to try and improve the state of what people know about their field and dispel some major misconceptions. So for example, if we're talking psychology, I'll highlight a few instances of actual tweets that exist out there where researchers have engaged in all of these processes. So for example, this cool Twitter thread that I encountered a while ago of I believe Dr. Amir is an evolutionary anthropologist. So she created this interesting thread where she solicited people to identify some outdated or debunked scientific ideas. So it inspired a conversation where people threw their hat in and offered some of what they knew to be outdated or no longer accepted scientific ideas. And she started with a few of ones that she was familiar with. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Myers-Briggs personality questionnaire. A huge misconception out there is that this is a really important and useful personality questionnaire. The Myers-Briggs is often used by employers for God knows what. People talk about their personality results from the Myers-Briggs. I'm here to tell you that the Myers-Briggs is garbage. It's actually displayed basically no what we call validity or reliability, right? The results that people get are highly inconsistent. There's no indication that the Myers-Briggs is actually capturing stable or real personality traits. All the research indicates that it's pretty useless. So people should stop using it. So that's a big misconception that the Myers-Briggs is the best personality questionnaire that we have out there. It's not. There are way better personality questionnaires that exist out there, and there's a ton of personality psychology on our stable personality traits that have led to the creation of good personality questionnaires. So that's a big misconception. The Myers-Briggs, it is garbage, and we should stop using it. Another big misconception from the field of psychology is the idea of what we call learning styles. Now, this was a really popular topic that was studied pretty extensively. The idea was that individuals have learning style preferences, that some people like visual information, pictures, and videos. Some people prefer to hear things, some people prefer to read things. The research has debunked the importance of learning styles. People do report having preferences of how they like to receive information, but there is zero indication that catering to learning style differences improves learning outcomes or improves grades. The idea that learning styles are an important pedagogical tool has been debunked. We don't need to pay attention to learning styles to help people learn. But again, this is a common misconception. People still talk about the importance of learning styles. It's still used in some classroom settings, despite the fact that wasting time or energy on catering to learning styles has really no effect on learning outcomes. Another big one that I'm not sure how many people are aware of this. So the Stanford Prison Experiment that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the basic gist of the Stanford Prison Experiment, we learned in recent years that not only was the Stanford Prison Experiment ethically questionable, it was actually fraudulently reported. And this was something that I only learned because I follow some prominent psychologists on Twitter who basically dug deep into the archives of information available about the Stanford Prison Experiment, who uncovered that there was some seriously misleading information about how the Stanford Prison Experiment was structured. Okay, so basically the Stanford Prison Experiment found seemingly that the effect of authority could be that it turns people into sort of authoritarian violent monsters. It was slightly fraudulent because further interviews and archival research has indicated that the research assistants heavily directed and told participants to behave in certain contrived ways. So the results of the Stanford Prison Experiment don't reflect a natural reality and don't reflect a sort of a natural psychological effect. It was basically sort of a fraudulent or contrived experiment. And so the effects and the conclusions from the Stanford experiment need to be highly revamped to reflect that. So this is something that, based on the fact that I follow various psychologists who are involved in this project, I was able to update my understanding of the Stanford Prison Experiment so that I can more effectively and accurately teach it when I next go out to teach Intro to Psychology. Now, obviously, Twitter is going to be an avenue where people can get into little bitch fights and respond whenever they hear something about themselves they don't like. And academics are no exception. So Dr. Zimbardo himself, the guy who created the Stanford Prison Experiment, he was free to respond and basically refute what the people who found the problematic aspects of the Stanford Prison Experiment. He basically could refute their account that his study was bogus. So this sort of leaves us in a place where we all have to decide as individuals who we want to believe and what we want to believe based on the strength of the evidence. Me personally, I don't quite buy what Dr. Zimbardo is selling. He's self-interested and obviously wants to keep his most famous study in high regard. But you as an individual, you can go read more and you can come to your own conclusion. That's sort of, I would say, one of the positive things of Twitter is that this conversation can take place and that people can then come to their own decisions. There's a lot of medical misconceptions out there, and it's not just psychologists, it's all manner of scholars and doctors who are working on Twitter to dispel major medical misconceptions. So one field where there's a horrifying amount of medical misconceptions is in the field of gynecology. Any of you that are women could probably relate to the fact that you're constantly getting terrible advice about your body and what is normal about the female body, and all sorts of products and bullshit things that we should do to make our bodies better. OBGYN, Dr. Jennifer Gunter, she's got a Twitter that's basically primarily focused on debunking some really horrific gynecological advice that women receive. I would say that that's a good thing. There's some really horrible misconceptions about the field of gynecology, and women believing those misconceptions can lead to some pretty bad health outcomes. So having a doctor out there who is interested in dispelling those bits of misinformation is something that can be really helpful, in this case, to women's health and well-being. In particular, she's got a lot of information debunking a lot of the bullshit that Gwyneth Paltrow puts out into the world about women's health and well-being. Gwyneth Paltrow and her Goop brand is always trying to sell women some dumbass bullshit to put into their bodies, and really I think that it's a positive thing that someone is out there trying to misspell the misconceptions that a misguided non-expert celebrity is putting out into the world. Do you guys ever feel like there's nutrition research out there that's constantly contradicting itself? Right? One day it's that a glass of red wine with dinner is good for your heart. The next day is that drinking it all is going to cause you to die of a heart attack at an early age. Right? Is cheese good for you? Is cheese bad for you? Is coffee good for you? Is coffee bad for you? If you feel like that information is constantly contradicting itself, you're right. This entire field that we term nutritional epidemiology, or the study of the relationship between food and drink and disease, is pretty garbage. And Dr. Vinay Prasad, another MD, he's got a Twitter that's primarily focused on dispelling some really bogus pseudoscience, and in particular, he's blown up the spot of quite a lot of shoddy medical information, some really poorly done medical research, and he does it using some pretty expressive language. Again, this is the kind of thing that wouldn't fly in a medical journal, but he's out there dispelling misconceptions and not mincing his words. His tweets are highly informative. They can get a little technical, but still, it's going to be in language that's a bit more accessible and easy to follow for someone who's not an MD, and dispelling a misconception on research that really we hear about far too often and misconceptions abound. Now, interestingly, history is a field that has some pretty huge followings on Twitter. There's a lot of pretty prominent historical oriented Twitter accounts by historians, run by historians themselves, that have pretty massive Twitter followings. Me personally, I love following history Twitter accounts because it's something that I'm interested in, but not primarily an expert on. So, for example, I follow Dr. Heather Cox Richardson out of BC, who's an expert on early American history. So, when we had a government shutdown last year, this was the kind of event that historical context could really advance our understanding of why we were experiencing a shutdown just last year. And so, getting that historical context in a really compelling, easy to read format, right? This would be a Twitter account and a Twitter thread that I consider really easy to read and really informative, right? It provided me a ton of really cool historical information that gave me more insight and understanding of a more recent historical moment. So, following these kinds of historical Twitter accounts, I think, is tremendously useful because history stays relevant. History repeats itself, and history is all about aiding in our analysis of present moments. So, like I mentioned, there's actually a ton of history Twitter accounts out there, more so than any other academic field that really I've noticed. And so, there's been some speculation as to why this is. Again, like I mentioned, um, history is the kind of field that people might misconceive as being all about memorizing facts and dates. That's really not primarily what it's about. It's about challenging misconceptions. It's about making sure that we understand the context that historical events provide for present moments. So it's all about dispelling misconceptions. And so, interestingly, a lot of historical tweets and Twitter accounts get a lot of eyes on them in Twitter. The idea that they call them Twitter historians, that historians on Twitter are constantly going about shedding light on current news stories, I think is really important. And I think it goes a lot towards helping people be more informed and making sure that people don't live with the misconceptions of the past and that we constantly are updating what we believe about the present moment based on historical context. And this is the kind of thing that academics and historians are doing completely outside of the normal work that they do day to day, right? Historians and academics are not getting tenure, or they're not typically gaining a lot of professional success by spending time writing tweets and writing Twitter threads. It takes a lot of time, and it's the sort of thing that if somebody is a diligent academic, they're going to spend a lot of time putting together well sourced information. So I'll reiterate, this isn't the kind of thing that's within the normal bounds of what academics do day to day. It's the kind of thing that researchers are doing because they want to inform people. So, interestingly, there can't be anything on social media without a contrarian hot take. So, interestingly, within the past year, there was an article published on the Chronicle of Higher Ed that basically argued that academics shouldn't be using social media, that all of the sort of classic complaints about social media applied to academics using the platforms, that basically social media is making, quote, scholars impatient, vicious, and dull. Way harsh. Academics do not lack for means of transmitting scholarship and ideas. We teach, write, and lecture. Scholarship takes time. Yeah, but as we've covered, right, a peer reviewed article takes forever to get published, and who's going to read it? This complaint to me just rings quite hollow. Yeah, academics don't necessarily lack for means of transmitting information, but is it going to be a transmission that actually reaches people and that people actually understand? So basically, the complaint in this linked article was that Twitter is all about self promotion and it's not actually promoting information and scholarship. Blah, blah, blah. Whatever. Fuck off, Chronicle of Higher Ed. Now, obviously, this had to get even more meta with academics on Twitter complaining about the article about academics on Twitter. So basically, a fair amount of academics responded and basically said that a huge complaint that academics have received for a long time is that we're too out of touch and we don't engage with the public enough. Twitter is letting people do that. And then the complaints follow that it's not actually part of our standard job, that it's not what we're supposed to be spending our time on. So a lot of academics agreed with my point of view that basically it was a stupid contrarian take, that obviously Twitter can be a platform that is going to promote self-promotion, and it's not always going to be accurate, and people can fire off tweets too quickly. Largely, though, I would agree with the people in the tweets that I've screenshotted here that really it's important for academics and scholars to try and find ways to transmit their information in a way that people are actually going to be able to see it. And even though Twitter does enable people to say dumb stuff and to say wrong things, I think that overall it's for the better. I think it's good that scholarship is being made available and more accessible on Twitter. Okay, so again, people disagreed, and I would basically agree with this point of view that Twitter isn't necessarily making academia or scholarship worse, right? Obviously, the same problems with social media that exist generally are going to exist in scholarship discourses on social media. It mostly just highlights people's character flaws and it highlights people's worst qualifications and qualities. But it also allows people to transmit information in a way that more people are going to see it. So all of the bad characteristics of people are still going to be there when they exist on social media. And I think the idea that Twitter scholarship is changing academia for the worse, overall, I think it's overstated. And another point that I find particularly personally relevant as a contingent faculty myself, right? Academia is a environment in which certain people are regarded as higher status and more important. People who are tenured and tenure tracked are considered higher status and more important, and that's just the truth. People that don't have the same security of employment, people who have been forced out of academia entirely, people who have contingent employment like adjuncts and like me, right? We're not necessarily going to have the same platforms that more powerful people in academia have. Twitter is a more democratic platform that gives everyone a voice and it lets everyone have the opportunity to make their voice heard. Again, I'm going to argue that that's a good thing. So then lastly, I wanted to highlight to you guys, or I wanted to let you know that I wanted to conduct an email interview akin to what I did in the last lecture, where God damn it, Jade, I'm almost done. Hold on. Jade, come here. Hey, hey. All right, you stay there. All right, anyways, so I wanted to conduct a quick email interview with someone who uses social media just in this way that I've mentioned, basically as a platform for promoting his own research and scholarship. So, my former advisor, Dr. Clay Rutledge, actually, he's got a pretty prominent Twitter presence. When I last checked, he had something like 20,000 Twitter followers, but that was a while ago, so I'm assuming it's grown since then. So his research focuses quite a bit on the psychological phenomenon of nostalgia, and he's considered somewhat of an expert on that topic. So since he had a pretty prominent Twitter following, I wanted to ask him a few questions on his experience being an academic on Twitter. So I asked him just a few questions about what his experience has been like. He mentioned that he started his Twitter account basically because he was writing a book and he wanted a platform to help promote his project. And so some element of self promotion is there. He also saw social media as a place to explore ideas and have conversations, right? Twitter has enabled more academics to make remote connections, right? Not everyone is capable of going to an academic conference, right? So social media is going to be a place where you can have more conversations about scholarship with people. So he was able to make new connections and have interesting conversations with people. Some of the downsides of social media he mentioned, right? He did mention that sometimes people do get into dumb little bitch fights on social media. Right? Sometimes people do get into petty arguments and they act foolishly on social media, right? It's the same sort of thing that any of us on social media can relate to, that sometimes you're going to say something dumb. Academics are no exception. So I basically asked for his advice on how to do it well, and he mentioned something that I think is really important. He said it takes self-discipline to do social media well, be cautious, and be kind. I just think that's really great advice, right? As I mentioned before, social media what you put on the internet, it's going to be forever, right? So you don't want to put something out there that you regret, right? Obviously, we're going to do that at some point. We can be reckless, we can be dumb, but I think the advice is good. If you want to fire off a tweet, if you want to post something on Snapchat, just pause and think about it. Think about whether or not it's something you'd regret saying. Think about whether or not it's something that's harmful or hurtful. So often we forget the importance of kindness when we're sitting behind a computer screen. I think, particularly now that so many of our interactions are taking place remotely, it's impossible to overstate the importance of just trying to be a kind person. That's not to say you won't always agree with everyone, but do your best to have your interactions reflect the kindness and generosity that you have as a person. Okay, so basically, overall, there's pros and cons to social media generally, and there's pros and cons to academia and scholarship moving to Twitter, right? Academic scholarship being promoted on Twitter, it's a relatively new phenomenon. So, all of the pros and cons, the bad and the good of social media are going to exist in this ring as well. So, it's a newish phenomenon. So, it takes some time for people to figure out how to do it well. I would say a major pro, though, is that scholarship and research should be something that's accessible to people outside of the immediate field. I think scholarship should be something that everyone can have access to. And so putting your work out on Twitter, I think, is a good thing. And on a point that I mentioned a couple slides ago, right? Scholarship should be the kind of thing where anyone who has something to say, some expertise, some insight should be able to put out there. Um, right? People who have left academia or have been unable to continue in academia, Twitter is going to provide them an avenue whereby they can continue to highlight their work that they consider important. So, overall, again, I would say you take the bad with the good. Now, finally, what you're going to do for your weekly assignment this week, just hop on Twitter and find a Twitter account. Even if you don't have a Twitter account, you should be able to go on twitter.com and search for public accounts. Most academic accounts are going to be public, so you shouldn't have too much trouble with this. So, what I'd like you to do is just find any Twitter account that you would consider to be academic or scholarly in some way. So, a professor, a researcher, a student account, a lab account, MDs, psychiatrists. So it should focus on scholarship of some kind. So that means no celebrities, no politicians, not journalists, unless they're a professor of journalism or something, no influencers. Um, and don't give me Dr. Oz, Dr. Phil, or Dr. Drew because they're all garbage. They're really all garbage. Try and find something that's a bit more reputable and scholarly. So, again, anyone who's a professor, any other MDs, psychiatrists, there's just a ton out there. So, just find an account on a topic of your choosing that you think you would be able to learn something from. So, I'm going to end it there. Thank God I'm so tired of talking. I hope you guys are well, and I'll talk to you soon.